So I've been spending the past 2 weeks gearing like crazy. I've spent like 1.5 million gold on the auction house. I've enchanted and gemmed everything, rank 3, gone full crazy on both my warriors, and now I just wonder, what do the bosses do?
Okay, so maybe we should take a look at raid prepping. Have you been doing any?
I mean, didn't you hear my intro? No, of course,
Yeah,
yeah. I've looked at the raid a bit. Yeah. How about you?
yeah. Uh, I thought we could talk a bit about our process of raid prepping. Um,
Yeah.
and even though we've talked about it before, I guess we can mention that neither of us have PTR tested. But maybe that's where we start discussing the prep.
Yeah. I think maybe we can sort of outline the different sort of stages of raid prep and what one might do and what we sort of do at those different points in time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think you can sort of break it down into before stepping into the raid and then being in the raid. And maybe later in the episode we can talk about how you adapt during a progression fight. But to start then, what have you actually ever PTR tested?
Yes, I did quite a bit of raid testing on the Mists of Pandaria beta. But obviously
Okay,
that
so a while back.
yeah, that's over 10 years ago at this point, right? 14 years ago. I don't know. Long time ago at this point. So not in recent memory, no.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I haven't done any serious raid prepping at all. I've just, I mean, PTR testing at all. I've joined some PTR fights. When I've had the time, I think it can be a lot of fun. But basically, you're put in the position where you just have to look at the dungeon journal and try and figure out what the boss do, or at least know what mechanics the boss have, so you can get somewhere in the hour you have to test. Because normally you have an hour to test one boss, and then you get access to the second boss, and then it's over for the night. So, do you remember from your mop days how you perceived the PTR fight for the first time?
Um, not well, a little bit, but I guess it's probably better now than it was back then. But like, I think still to this day, all the PTR servers are US. So when you play EU, you kind of have a little bit of extra ping, and that probably works okay today. But when I did the MOP beta testing, you know that didn't really work very well.
Okay.
So it kind of took away from the experience, and you were also forced to level a character and gear a character to be able to do the testing and stuff. It was a bit different than it works now. Um, and also at that point there was no. I don't think there was a dungeon journal at that point. I don't remember when that actually was added.
Oh, okay. And then it would have been completely blind if there was none.
Yeah, so I think we can probably disregard my very old
Okay.
experience there.
Okay, but I'll do a quick rant about my experience. I haven't done it for the War Within, but I did some in Dragonflight, and I think there's a few points that are kind of interesting. I think, firstly, you're in a position where the people who raid test, most of them are interested in either testing the raid or testing the class, and I think more than you'd think are actually interested in the raid and cooking up their own strats. So I haven't really felt that there's been a lot of room to actually cook, right? Not that it's been my main objective, but there's enough people talking about what the mechanics do and how you could solve them, you know? And then I think there's the other aspect of it's quite easy to be distracted about your class. Because even if you're trying to test a boss, you're playing with a new tier set or some reworked talents or something, you know, with a wonky UI, and it is a bit difficult to PTR test, I think. And honestly, the biggest reward, like bar none, is just getting familiar in the boss room, getting some sort of feeling for the pacing of the mechanics and stuff. Do you remember feeling like it actually helped being just having played the boss for an hour, even though you did no meaningful progress or the incorrect strat? It's just, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say actually that was the only thing I actually remember from those days, because when we actually did the normal and heroic, because I mean back then heroic was the hardest difficulty there was, right?
Yeah.
We actually, because we had at that point also you could test like the last boss and stuff as well, which you can't really do now. But yeah, I did actually feel that like a lot, especially because back then I was also playing tank, so I guess it's a bit more important, at least in the early pulls, for the tank to have familiarity with the boss as well, since you're more sort of dictating what happens, or at least where the boss is standing and stuff like that. So yeah, I definitely felt like that part sort of helped, and I think for sure that part would help now as well. But as you mentioned, I mean, the barrier to entry to start PTR testing is very, very high, because you have to copy over your character, you have to try to make your like UI sort of work, and initially they don't allow add-ons on the PTRs, and or they might not work, and then they start getting updates that work on the PTR, but then you changed a macro on live and it didn't change, and then it didn't work, and then you had a new tier. So there's this whole thing, and it's just hard to focus on that if you're not like really, really trying to do it with your guild, or so, in a very serious sort of setting, and plus, the whole thing of having very limited time on each boss, right?
Yeah, I also think it's a bit more awkward in the EU. I don't know what the time is in the US, but raid testing is usually Thursday or Friday, I think, and it's at 22. So like setting off Friday at 10 o'clock at night can be kind of rough. I'm not sure if they've ever been on Saturday, but
Yeah,
I find that the times have been the biggest reason I haven't PTR tested each raid, because yeah, it's just awkward.
Yeah, but I think the time that a lot of those things started would be like in the early or mid afternoon, depending on where you are in the US as well, right? So it's not necessarily super awesome. Usually you would be at work at that time. So yeah, I don't know. It's not. I don't think it's great, but I guess it's the only compromise they can make, right? Because they don't want to make it midnight in Europe, because then no one would do it almost. And they don't want to make it too early in the US, because then also no one would do it, I guess, from there. So I guess that's a compromise that they had to make.
Yeah, it might be super reasonable. I'm just saying, I honestly think that's the main reason I haven't PTR tested more. I find it very valuable to just get a feel of the boss and the boss room and everything, but it doesn't sound like neither of us are cooking strats from the PTR by ourselves. I honestly think that there are very few people who stand something to gain from it. I would believe that the most benefit you would get is by like testing how a mechanic interacts with different sort of utility. Like, can I immune this? Can you snare remove this? Can you cheese it in some way? And they might fix it, but at least you know how it worked on the PTR.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of value to be had from the perspective of, being familiar with the fight, because, the first and second week you pull like heroic or whatever, the familiarity is very different. Like just the feeling of having done it before, even if you didn't have to deal with any singular mechanic, it's still a very big difference. So for sure, I think a lot of guilds, even on, really, really high level of guilds, like probably like world top 15 or whatever, that are whatever the best guilds are that don't actually PTR test at all. I mean, that still definitely could make a difference for them, but it's not that major, and it's also pretty boring, I think. And especially now when heroic week is back, at least for this tier, it for sure removes that advantage by probably like 95% or something, right? Because you're under no time pressure. As long as you can clear your heroic week splits, it doesn't matter if you wiped an extra time or whatever, and you sort of gain that familiarity back already in the heroic week anyway.
Yeah, that's true. But then I guess it would be kind of good for people who doesn't like to raid prep to just PTR test a bit, because a lot of people don't do enough preparing, and they sort of live by the motto of learning by doing and learning by playing the fight. I mean, if that's who you are and you're not interested in watching a YouTube video or a guide or something, PTR test might be a decent way of just not dying that first time on a specific mechanic that you didn't realize happened.
Yeah, for sure. That would probably make a lot of sense for people. But if you're not gonna do any raid prep, or you're really gonna go and raid on the PTR, probably
Yeah,
not.
it might be very conflicting. That's true, but
Yeah. But I guess we can. The thing we can say at least is that there definitely is a potential stage of like you could be reading the dungeon journal, you could be thinking about things for the, for the PTR, and you could be testing things on the PTR or whatever. But that's not really where we're not really focused on that part at least, right? And I think the main thing that we get out of the PTR is that other people test and make videos and things like that from the PTR, and there are logs from the PTR as well.
Yeah, that's great. And the only personal in-game benefit would be to get a feel for the boss and the pacing and such.
Yeah.
But if we move on to, should we do it in as the raid is released now with normal and heroic week and then mythic separated?
I think so. I guess, yeah. We can talk a little bit after the whole thing, maybe what difference that would have made. But I guess
Okay.
for now we can focus on the way it works. But maybe we should just go into as well before, just like what sort of perspectives we sort of come in with here now. Because first of all, we used to be before, like, this is the first tier now in many many years where you and I are not coming in as sort of the leadership of a guild, right?
Yeah.
You were more on the end, more of the sort of raid prepping part together with another guy, and I think you did a lot of the sort of healing cooldowns and stuff. Whereas I was more, my sort of role in the leadership as the guildmaster was more dealing with a lot of non-raid related problems. And I think the most things that I did inside of the raid was more like loot distribution and these things, which is an interesting topic on its own, but maybe not something we're gonna touch too much on today.
Yeah, and I think even if I didn't have extra raid prepping responsibilities, and it is quite a big difference going into the raid as a melee DPS and as a healer. Like just in the
Certainly,
way
yeah.
you prep and how much prep you would have to do, kind of. But
Yeah,
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 that.
definitely.
But if we look at normal and heroic then, because that's pretty much exactly where we are as of right now. We haven't stepped in yet. It's pre-heroic normal week. What have you been doing to prepare for the boss fights?
Right. So obviously, first, you gotta get your character ready, and first week of the season, obviously, that's a little bit more sort of, you know, what would you say? There's a little bit more to it than if it was like the second or third season, because now you came in with nothing, right? You had to like level characters and everything. So, barring that, obviously, which we've already spoken about in previous weeks, preparing your character to actually have full crafted gear and best trinkets and whatever you can have. Thinking more about actually preparing for the raid. That in and of itself is also for me split into two things. One which is sort of not directly related to this raid, and then things that are more sort of related to this particular raid, the Narrowbar Palace or whatever it's called. So first of all, I've sort of looked at all of the bosses. Obviously, I've looked at the videos from the PTR. So there's a bunch of channels that do this. We have like Ready Check Pull. We have Stanky Gaming. We have Signs of Kilani. Probably other people. There are a bunch of people who, raid on the PTR and try to come up with some strategies that work for normal and heroic. So obviously, I've looked through all of these. I've looked through Mythic Trap, which is another website that does like really good breakdowns of all of the fights and all the difficulties. I think they've partnered up with Echo as well. So I try to do those things to sort of get some sort of familiarity with the bosses. You never get quite as good of familiarity from just watching a video as you would just pulling the fight even once yourself. But having seen it, you can sort of figure it out yourself. So like, just as like some random example from this raid, right? On, is it Silken Court that has the like web thing where you're stopping the boss?
Yes.
Yeah. So for example, just having seen that someone do that mechanic on a few different videos, etc., that would mean like once I actually get it, because usually also on heroic and normal, you have enough time to sort of react to all mechanics. It's only on mythic where they give you these rough overlaps generally. So usually on heroic and normal, all the mechanics come one by one. So usually you have enough time to just react. And if you just have any idea what it's doing, you can sort of solve it sort of at the time. So that would be sort of the boss specific type of prep that I've been doing. Haven't really been looking too much at logs since they're not even from like the PTR. They would be like beta logs at this point, so that's not super relevant. And then the other thing obviously is to sort of prepare in terms of like what am I actually going to be playing. So for me, since I'm a DPS warrior, I would have to look at like, am I playing arms, am I playing fury? Turns out that it's hard to know, and they're very, very similar, so I had to prepare both of them. I'll set up all of my talents and everything for what I'm suspecting for different bosses, try out different rotations, change some things in the APL, run some sims, see if I can improve upon the sort of public sims that are out there, etc. So yeah, that's pretty much the sort of prep that I've been doing going into this week. But I'm assuming the prep that you've done is very different from this.
Yeah. Just one question before I tell my side. Have you had to, or have you prepped any sort of DPS warrior specific cooldowns for a fight? Like, have you? Yeah, you go.
You mean I was just going to clarify your question. So you mean like a cooldown timing or something, or what did you?
Yeah, like, have you looked at QVSA and thought this would be where I pop my cooldowns or stuff
Um,
like that?
no, not. We'll probably revisit that because that's something I'll be doing a lot in Mythic probably. But no, for Heroic, probably just gonna pop my cooldowns all the time when they're ready. I think usually again Heroic doesn't really punish you for many things, and there's very rarely anything in like Heroic where oh shit, you didn't DPS this phase fast enough or whatever, which you couldn't just natty do or whatever with people who already had things up. Um, so yeah, no, not yet,
Okay.
but we'll revisit that later for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I think there are a few differences in the roles we play, but I also think even if we both played the same role, we would prep differently since I think we just approach differently. But basically, I haven't been watching many guide videos. I've been mainly reading through the mechanics on Wowhead, and they have some sort of sheet in collaboration with some other entity. And then there's a guy in Instant Dollars that have posted a video of all their Mythic PTR testing. So I've been watching that throughout the weeks a couple of times. Not rewatch it to just rewatch it, but I basically often have a goal of creating a sheet or some sort of resource, and it's to 95% for myself, and then I can share it with some people if they care. So my sheet basically includes boss mechanics because I'm very interested in being able to generically apply some sort of purpose to them. So for every boss I've separated stack, spread, healing damage, and generic important mechanics. Important would be something to watch out for or some special assignment in my head. And I do that just to color code my bigwigs. I think this takes most of the actual raid boss prepping for myself. And then I go through pretty much the same thing again. I look at mostly text resources and a PTR VOD. And I try to do healing cooldowns in the Viserio sheet, which is quite a common way to sort your raid cooldowns nowadays. And that can take even longer just because you have to go through like 4 to 5 healers depending on how many you play. And I think that's pretty much the bulk of it, but it's not very time efficient, I would say. The only part I think is worth my time is looking at each boss fight and trying to place mechanics into certain categories because that helps me remember what mechanics they have, and also just for it being easier in the first week, having some sort of color coordinated bigwigs.
Right.
And as a healer, I don't think to answer the question I asked you, I think the class specific prep goes into the healing sheet. If I wasn't helping out with the healing cooldowns, I would to some extent do it for myself just to figure out the timers. Because when you start creating the sheet, you notice that okay, this mechanic is paced every 50 seconds. This is really awkward for Miss Weaver. And then you notice this is paced every 2 minutes. This is perfect, and then you sort of figure out how you play the fight. But I think timing is a lot more important as a healer than generic like min-max of your rotation throughout the fight, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, for sure. I
So
th-
yeah.
I think especially in heroic week, since I mean, basically what you're doing is you're basically saying like, well, we're gonna have some healing cooldowns ready for whatever events are happening in the fight, and that will sort of ensure that we don't sort of randomly die, because healing is a bit different, right, from DPS. DPS is like everyone can just do more DPS and it's just better pretty much always. Whereas healing, it doesn't help if everyone's doing 400% of their normal healing on the pull, right? It doesn't.
Yeah.
There's no point, right? You need to stagger it in some way. So that definitely makes sense that you would need to do more class specific prep, I guess you would call it, and then also sort of prepping within the healing group as a whole.
Yeah, and it's been, as a side note, it's been a lot more annoying or a lot more work to do with splits, because swapping out a few classes can change the timers quite a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's in general what I do, and I think it's definitely enough for heroic. But I think my mindset is mainly I'm trying to remove as much thinking on my feet that I have to do in the fight, by having a weak aura pop up and saying what cooldown to use, and having a green bar for every healing mechanic on the big wigs helps me not trying to think about which mechanic did which thing, So I'm basically just trying to relieve brain activity in some way, so I can focus on not standing in stuff and generally performing well.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that, and I like to do color coding for a lot of things, but not for this. I think there is like a default color coding. It's not like all of them come with the same color, I'm pretty sure. But the one thing that I do that I think, I mean, I guess to some people that might sound silly rating in a relatively high end guild, but I play with this like DBM voice pack. And so especially like it's not like it help. I mean, it can help in like late prog as well, but especially like in the early prog, it can really help, because what will end up happening is like you get targeted by some mechanic. I mean, you could see on the timer that was incoming or whatever. That part doesn't matter so much, especially in heroic week, where you don't really need to you very rarely need to like move or sort of prepare for being targeted by a mechanic in heroic. But usually what ends up happening is it's going to say like spread or stack or run away or stand still, or it like there's like a very large number of voice lines that they have that will explain, because like almost every mechanic in World of Warcraft raiding can be condensed down to some combination of a few sort of simple things that you may need to do to sort of counteract them. And then it only really gets difficult in Mythic when they sort of present you with 2, 3, 4 mechanics at the same time, and you have to do something sort of when they sort of happen at the same time. But sort of in heroic, when they sort of usually happen just one by one, staggered in that fashion, it usually is enough to just be told something like that. This is a runaway mechanic. This is spread mechanic, whatever. And also, I guess in more recent years, they've become better at the base, not even the base UI, but more like the base like visuals of the mechanics sort of show you what you're supposed to do almost. So for example,
but I think that makes a lot of sense, because it's sort of, if you get targeted by a mechanic and something says spread, you don't have to search for information. You know what you need to do to some extent without looking for it. I think we're actually doing the same thing, you by having DBM and me by color coding my bigwigs. We're separating out the information, but I think audio is an interesting topic in itself, because for the most part, audio is sort of uncontested or unused real estate in gaming or in WoW raiding, because you have a lot to look at in your screen. And I think it's even more true for a healer, because you're looking at the frames all the time. That's why healers stand in fire, because you cannot not look at the frames, right?
Yeah. Right, yeah.
And then audio has become I become really selective with audio, because I usually use it in a very simple but very dumb way, to where I set either a weak aura, or more often than not, when I realize something is difficult for me to catch. And I think this also might be a byproduct of playing ranged priest for a long time, where I'm slow and I just can't react to spread because I can't just run out. You can leap, right?
Yeah.
So I've been setting countdowns for stuff, and usually in different languages. So I know that the German countdown for me for a long time has usually been some sort of tank related thing I need to worry about, and some Korean female voice usually is something to look out for in the raid, like something important under my bigwigs categories. So I know I swapped to DBM for a fight because bigwigs wasn't working for it, and I couldn't handle it. It was so much talking and so much pinging, and it was very confusing for me, since I usually save audio for like the thing I find really important that I'm having trouble tracking or pre-placing for, or whatever it could be. So basically what I want to say is that audio is actually really powerful for whatever you feel like is important to you on the fight, because you won't miss it if something says spread, or if some random German dude start counting down, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can definitely say that, you know, for people who just play with sound off and just listen to music or whatever, that's, you know, there's surely, you know, some sort of awareness to be had by incorporating sounds in one way or another into your
Yeah.
sort of setup, because it can really help, and it doesn't take up any real estate on your screen, which is really good.
Yeah, it's just an extra sensory organ, whatever you want to call it. It's
Yeah.
actually good, because I think we've all missed something glowing in our face because you're looking like 10 centimeters away from it.
Yeah, I mean, you could even take it further, right? If you get like a smell generator, and you know when it starts to smell like sausages, you know, oh shit, I have to spread, or you know, you could start doing something like that, but
Yeah.
that's maybe a bit too slow. But yeah, the sound cues are really good, so I think that definitely is a great tip for anyone trying to sort of improve their game. You don't have to do what either of us are doing, but just incorporating sound cues in any way would probably be helpful for most people if you're not using them already.
Yeah. Yeah, sound cues are really, really good. Do you remember what you were talking about before I interrupted you?
Yeah, I mean, it was just about the sound cues, right? I don't know if there was anything else. But let's just move on. I think we'll see if it comes back. But
Okay, but basically then you fiddle with your sims, you look at like provided guides in form of text and in form of videos, and you try and just get a sense of the heroic, because you feel like heroic is obvious enough to where you can, with some knowledge, react correctly to the situation.
yeah, exactly. Like I don't want to go in blind and just like not know, because like obviously if you go in blind, even with being told like spread or whatever, you're gonna miss something and you're gonna screw up, right? So I want to check and then mostly keep an eye out for like these killer mechanics, you know, that can wipe the raid or that can kill you or whatever, right? Because a lot of the times, like random mechanics in heroic, like if you forget to, I don't know, if you forget to spread with some mechanic, and you get stacked up and both of you get damaged or something. Usually you don't die from those things in heroic unless you know you very egregiously fail, like 5 people stack on or something, right? So yeah, I definitely feel like there could be more prep I could do for the heroic week, but I try to keep it on a level where I'm definitely not going to be like a detriment to my raid, but I sort of feel like I'm better suited to save a lot of that sort of prep for mythic, where it's going to make a lot of a bigger difference.
Yeah. And then to summarize what I do, I think I more live in sheets, if it's my own or if it's healing sheets, and I try to prepare the timers or understand the timings of the fights, and I use a color coded bigwigs instead of audio cues for the mechanics to start out with. But if we look forward, okay, let's say next week on Monday you've done, not even Monday, let's say next week on Wednesday you've done your first split, everything went kind of fine. Is there something you would usually change for the next raid? Is there something you find yourself consistently looking up or editing or changing up, you know?
Yeah, I think there's two sort of main things that I'll be looking at, and I'll actually even be looking at them in between the time where we are now, which is the Monday before we haven't had the release in NA or EU yet, and before I even start my raid
Oh,
on
yeah, that's true.
Wednesday.
Yeah.
And the thing actually is that when the release comes out in NA, that will be in the evening on Tuesday for us in EU. So usually you can sort of sit and you can look at the Americans play. And first of all, obviously you can look at logs, you can look at like Raider IO and just see like, how many pull counts are people taking on different bosses, whatever. Is there anything like, let's say that you watch some of the better or similarly skilled American guilds to where you are, and you see that, well, okay, they managed to clear their raid, but they wiped on the fourth boss 9 times on heroic or something. Then that would indicate that, wait, there's something special about this boss that makes it a lot harder. So then I might go in and sort of preferably find a sort of VOD of my own spec or my own role, at least like a melee role, and try to see if there's anything I can do to sort of combat that. Where I used to do a lot of this sort of thing when I was a guildmaster, but then at that point it was more like, okay, well, why would this stop our guild, or just in general get a sort of sense of where we can expect things to go wrong or where we can expect things to be hard. And then, if it's more of a sort of a tactical issue, then I would probably offload it to, you or our other raid leader that we used to have. But just generally sort of taking the time there to actually utilize that extra information you can gain from NA.
Yeah.
But to move past that and to sort of move more further into the week, maybe after the first raid, etc. Of course, kind of same answer there, that if we struggled on any boss for some reason in the splits, then maybe it's a good idea to look into that. But other than that, usually what I'll do throughout the sort of the week is to keep track of like logs and sort of proportion of how many people are playing the different specs that are going to be relevant for me, so I know better for Mythic Week and can be sort of more prepared for that in terms of what I should focus my preparation on. And then also, of course, looking ahead, like what are the changes in Mythic and where are sort of choke points going to be. And, probably a good idea to think about like how far are we actually going to get, because we're probably not going to get to like the last boss of Mythic in the first week, right? It's probably going to take at least 3, 4, 5, whatever weeks, depending on how hard the tier is to get to the last boss. And then lastly, of course, if the last boss of Heroic is hard, that might also require more digging into and looking at. But the issue oftentimes is that even the Race to World First guilds don't kill the Heroic last boss early in the week. Which it will be the same for our type of guild as well. We'll do all of our rest of our splits first, and then we'll sort of end up going to the last bosses. But that also makes it a bit harder to research, because there's really not going to be many logs, right? So you're going to have to more sort of, prepare based on the normal version or something like that. So yeah, that's probably what I'm going to be thinking about during that week. What's your plan with this in mind?
Well, I think I forgot about the Tuesday NA release. I usually try and look at video more than logs, and then I try and look at logs on Wednesday. And I think it will be a bit different now, because usually in the past with our guild, I've been very fixated on watching the last boss these last couple of years, because you haven't seen the boss, right? So it's just a complete question mark, and I've generally been partly responsible of having to provide the strat and knowledge and cooldowns and whatever for it. So if I've been planning to get to the last boss on the Wednesday or the Thursday in either normal or heroic, that's been my focus. I think now, as you said, I would be very surprised if we pull that boss early in the week. So I'm not actually sure what I'm gonna do. I think I'm still gonna watch videos of the fights, and I'm gonna try and get an impression of which fight looks more rough than the other. It's great if you see people wipe, because then you can see what they wipe to. But honestly, for me, it's probably also gonna be trying to get to bed early so I can get to work early on Wednesday and then get home early on Wednesday.
Right.
But then throughout the first week, I think I live in my big wigs and weak cars the most because all my color coordination will need to be fixed. I will have vastly overestimated the amount of information I need. So like half of the things I've altered have been totally useless information. And I've missed something on the flight that was important that I didn't really realize might be more difficult to see in the moment. Like it could be a simple mechanic like you need to run out and I just didn't think it looked like I would need that information specifically, you know?
Yeah.
And then I think it's a lot of learning from the healing cooldowns, but not much else. I'm pretty much trying to still set up my UI, I think, and UI related issues. But I feel like I've done a lot of the prep like before, you know? Like I know what each boss does on Mythic, so that's not something I'm worried about figuring out, you know? I
Yeah.
feel like I'm more worried about figuring out the fight because I've done the outside prep. I just need to play it now, and I need to figure out what information do I want. Does this change in Mythic? Are the timers fine? Are there some gaps? I don't know. Very healer related stuff, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. But should we maybe think about then what happens when we get sort of closer to the Mythic Week? I guess kind of a similar thing happens again when on the Tuesday evening, NA will have the Mythic reset while we will still be in the Heroic Week. What are you gonna do during that last sort of night where you have that little overlap?
I think what I usually do is watch some high-end NA guild that's not liquid that just goes in and smashes Mythic. Because it's been a while since there was a heroic week, but usually, or even when it's not a heroic week, there are other guilds that go in. Like Big Dumb Guild used to be quite quick before they started trying harder. I'm guessing guilds like Instant Dollars or Pop Tart or whoever will go. So I'll try and find Mythic streams and not look at Liquid because they usually do splits, right?
Yeah, I mean the hard thing is like the you would only be able to watch guilds that are day raiding because otherwise it's going to be in the middle of the night for us if we look at the evening raids in NA. And the guilds that are day raiding, it would be kind of troll for them to go into Mythic. So they would usually just do another set of heroic splits or something before they jump into Mythic, probably.
Yeah, but there usually are some. It might not always be as high-end guild as I stated, but there are usually some guilds that go in and smash.
Yeah, there's this guild
Just
called the early shift that usually gets like the
oh
first
yeah,
three or 3 or 4 world first or something. Because for some reason they only care about those. They really want to get Mythic World first, I think, because they always do this, where they
yeah.
completely sacrifice and the splits. But I mean, to be fair though, I'm not like it doesn't feel like it would be that bad to do a little bit of because don't you think like if we maybe take a slight sidestep here to speculate, but don't you think like when there is a heroic week, do you think that after the heroic week it's 100% locked which characters in like Liquid and Echo and stuff like that that they're gonna play, or do you think it's still like we're gonna wait and do another set of splits in the Mythic week before we decide which characters we're gonna play?
I think it's still quite unsure, but I don't think it has anything to do with the bosses you're about to face, right? Like they must be worried about the comps for the hardest three bosses, right? And I wouldn't imagine that they're sure about like three of their classes or something.
Yeah, but isn't that sort of doesn't that just usually mean another person rather than another character for each person?
Oh, probably. I'm not sure, but I would guess so, yeah.
Because what I'm getting at now is it's
Yeah,
actually
okay, yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
then they're probably set on characters. They should have a quite decent hit rate on knowing which 24 characters they will play or something like that.
Yeah, and so what I'm kind of getting at then is that doesn't that sort of mean that if you are already set on which character everyone is playing at that point, that it would make sense to go into Mythic, because for the same reason that you go into Heroic, maybe we'd never said that, but I guess most people who do any form of relatively high-end rating will go Heroic before normal, because you want to give the Heroic gear first to the higher priority people like DPS players, and then you want like random normal pieces that get left over to get thrown to like healers and tanks and stuff. So because of that, people always usually do Heroic first. But with that same argument in mind, wouldn't it kind of make sense if, I mean, given that a few of the bosses are easy and they're going to be one shots anyway, or one or two or whatever shots, right? Doesn't it sort of make sense to step in a little bit into Mythic and then after that see like, okay, yeah, now these high prio people already got some pieces, so we don't waste gear from our Heroic split that we're gonna do?
I think it makes sense for us. I don't think it makes sense for Liquid and Echo, because they are just, as far as I see it, I think they're just grinding out Heroic, or they're grinding out splits to get max RNG gear on some characters, right? Like we talked about the other time, like Reves has a couple of warriors, he doesn't know which one he's gonna play. But they will spend the time to get the item level that they feel like they need. Because the only drawback of going into Mythic early is that if you wipe because you didn't have the last 2 item levels or 5 or whatever it could be, then you wasted time effectively, right? But for us and literally all other guilds, it's probably worth to get a feel on Mythic and kill the 1 to 3 bosses that are free and doesn't really affect the time spent, even if you would have had slightly better gear, because then you could go back to Heroic. But it doesn't feel like Raise the World First guilds does in that way. They usually don't even distribute the Mythic loot once they kill the bosses, right? Because they are playing a time game with the Mythic loot as well. When they actually step in, they are trying to get as far as they can before the trade window closes, right?
Yeah, I
We
mean
saw
they kind
Echo
of
do this the
screw.
other time, the other
Yeah,
tier.
yeah. I mean that got. I mean that got sort of changed up a bit, right? Because now the sort of trading window keeps running even when you're logged out. So just have, was it 4 hours, right? Yeah, 4 hours like real hours, whereas previously had 2 online hours, so you could do it in a lot more of a weird way before. Now you can't really do it in that
Yeah, but
crazy of a way.
that even incentivizes them more to not step into Mythic sooner than later, right? Because if we're assuming that they're just spamming splits until they reach a given item level, when they actually enter Mythic, I guess they want to kill 5 bosses or 6 bosses or something in those 4 hours, so that when they actually get to the boss that poses a problem, they can allocate gear to kill that boss. I'm pretty sure Echo did this in a Midrasil, even with the new trade system in mind. Like they started giving out loot on Larodar, and before that they hadn't even touched anything. And they even greeded then. Or wasn't it the same trade window then? I'm pretty sure it was.
Yeah, it was the same. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm
So I
sure
think
they
it's
did it, but
uniquely unique for them, for the Raise the World First guilds that are gonna do an insane amount of splits. But I think our guilds would benefit from going into Mythic, or could benefit from going into Mythic on Wednesday Mythic release and just killing 2 bosses and then doing the splits.
the only thing I mean is like, let's say that there's like a like super bis trinket from the fourth boss in the raid or something, and they run their like splits, and maybe now they end up. Let's say that that trinket would still be really good to have like on several characters, maybe on a tank or I don't know whatever they have in the split. But they can only now give it to one person in the split, even though it could have been useful for two. Because maybe it's like a trinket similar to the Arakara trinket, which is might be useful for everyone or something, right? They would have to pick which one of their DPS in that case, if there were like two people who wanted it or something in the split, that they would give it to, and then they would have to give it to the one who has the highest priority on it. But when they go into Mythic then and it actually drops, they're going to be forced to give the Mythic version to the lower priority person since they already gave the Heroic version to the other guy, which is the same argument to use why you run Heroic before Normal. I don't know, I just feel like there should be like, since the Heroic and Normal argument is so solved, it feels weird that there wouldn't be at least an analogous argument in some sense for Mythic versus Heroic as well.
Yeah, but I think what you're saying is true unless you are committing to running heroic until you have absolutely, because when that situation you describe happens for Echo and Limit or Liquid, I guess what they do is the guy who got the trinket is now only a helper, and then they do another split with a mirror alt of the one who didn't get a trinket. And they just go, 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 go. Obviously, there's some point when they have to call it quits. But I think stepping into Mythic and seeing if it drops, and if it drops, you can give it to someone who didn't have it. It wouldn't be a terrible idea, but I think they're losing out on min-maxing gear for the boss that first poses a threat. Because then they've already started the time and had to allocate all the gear if they're going to go back into heroic splits again. It seems to me that they're trying to delay going back into heroic splits as long as they can, if they need to go in again.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see at least now how it works out since.
Yeah, we can pay attention to it.
Yeah, because obviously we've had a full expansion now of no heroic week, and then obviously there's no possibility to really do this in the same way. You kind of had to start with the splits, right? There was no point to go directly into Mythic with no gear. That would be really weird. Because you also, of course, risk showing your tactics or whatever, right? That's also a thing that they probably consider as well. That there's some advantage to actually waiting it out as well.
Yeah, and then I think if we go back to the previous topic of heroic raid, something I forgot to mention is that I think in the later part of the heroic normal raid reset, I think that's when I start digging into logs for my own personal gain as well, because I feel like it's not as clear cut how you play it as a healer. If you're not playing disc, you're not exactly sure how the Giga players are actually performing, what talents they're using, since you don't have access to the same simulation options. So I think that's when I start digging into my actual character that I'm gonna play to make sure that I have everything figured out. And usually I have something specific I'm looking for. Like I'm not really sure if I need to always use ability A before B, and then I go hunting basically.
Right.
And I think another thing, sort of on the topic, is when you're watching videos. I know I talked about this in our old guild, but when you're watching a kill video to understand the fight, I think it's such a bait to watch a kill pov of your class. I think you should commit to watching two videos or 2 kills, and the first one you watch has nothing to do with your role. Like you just pick a healer and watch it, and then you will pay attention to the fight hopefully, and then you spend another 5 minutes to look at another video, and then you look at a warrior video, and you'll look more at what he's doing in the fight, right?
Yeah, I think actually that's sort of why I initially now I'm much more interested in watching, the guide videos or whatever that sort of go over the fight as a whole, rather than
Yeah.
trying to look at either a log or either a log or a like a VOD or a POV like of warrior or melee, because I just want to at this point in time I just want to get like a sense of the fight. Whereas much later, I will be much, much, much more interested because then I'll already know the fight or know the idea behind the fight, and then I'll be much more interested to know what can I do, or like what's going to happen to me. How do people deal with these different things? Like, again, not really applicable on heroic, but I guess we're sort of leading into now what's going to happen in the mythic week, right? So I'm gonna look at other players playing Mythic, and then I'll for sure look at like my class, right? Because I'll see things like say, oh well, I saw that they popped their defensive here. They maybe use like spell reflect, here, and they line it up like this. They heroic leap out of this mechanic. They take intervene to do this, like get all of those sort of specific things for the fight that tend to matter a lot more in Mythic. And at that point, I've already cleared Heroic. I've already sort of gotten an idea of how the fight works. I've looked into Mythic to see like what are the extra mechanics. Again, not gonna have like a super expert knowledge at this point of like how the fight's actually going to play out. That's what I'm sort of the next step I'm going to try to be learning here or figuring out. But at that point, it isn't very interesting for me as a random like raider in the guild, right? It's not super interesting for me to know if like the healers are gonna play like a weird mini game where one person has to do this dispel, another person has to do this. Like that doesn't matter for me, right? What matters for me when we get to Mythic, where there are a lot of mechanics, a lot of overlaps or whatever, what matters to me is like how do I, as a DPS warrior, deal with every sort of challenge that comes up throughout the fight, and how do I
Yeah.
pace my defensive, my offensive, my everything, you know?
Yeah, I just think that however it doesn't matter which way you prepare, as long as the preparation of the understanding of the boss isn't coming from a kill video of the class you're playing, I think it's good. Because imagine if you're just watching a mythic kill video of a warrior, and that's the prep you're gonna do. It doesn't matter if you watch the video once or 3 times. If you have a really poor understanding of the fight, that kill video might not be a good representation of how you play the fight. He might not get the mechanic, he might not do the duty, or whatever it could be, right? So when you're looking at something and you're not interested in the gameplay of the class you're watching, and that could be another class or it could be a kill video or something I'm not thinking of. But in general, I think it does a big difference just not solely relying on class specific or role specific information, just not to completely miss mechanics due to boss RNG, you know?
Yeah, no, I think I definitely agree, but I think that that isn't that isn't necessarily helped by watching another role's POV, since the same thing can kind of happen there. Like I'm watching some random preservation evoker POV, but he didn't get any mechanics, you know. But so I definitely agree that it's not a good idea to try to understand a fight from a singular POV one kill of the boss, right? Because
Yeah.
then you're very prone to missing things that just didn't happen to that person. But I think whereas I think like doing that, and usually not also one, but preferably more different
Yeah.
examples, right? But doing that can help you with a lot of things that are good for your sort of specific class or your specific role. But yeah, I definitely agree that like learning the actual mechanics of the fight, you need to know all of the mechanics, at least the ones that matter for you. So there might be like I don't care when the tanks are gonna taunt the boss, right? That's not for me.
Yeah, that doesn't really matter at all.
But certainly, I need to. I can't just pick a random video and then the guy never got targeted by the crazy kill the raid debuff, right? You need to know what to do with that. So that's where I definitely think that reading up on like Wowhead or Mythic Trap or anything about like what are the mythic mechanics and what is going to happen. And then of course, if there's any sort of specific strategy that the guild will be following. I mean,
Yeah.
I really like watching the broadcast from Echo or Liquid, to try to see what they're doing. Usually I'll have two windows open, or like I'll have like a window that I'm not showing, just watching like the main broadcast where they're usually gonna talk a little bit more. But it's not super interesting maybe. But sometimes they'll say some things about the fight. But then mostly I'll just have the POV of someone that I want to sort of watch what they're doing, which would usually be Reves in Echo or some other player in
Yeah.
Liquid, depending on what they're doing.
Yeah, maybe yeah, I get what you're saying. Maybe I'm just scarred from my own experience because I've been playing Disc Priest for a long time, and a lot of the kill videos have been Disc Priests, which is great. But I've found myself like having to rewatch the same fight 8 times because I just have been looking at what the disc's doing, like rotationally, you know. Um, so maybe
Yeah,
it's a bit different for you when you watch a warrior, but it's not that. What I'm trying to say is not that if the warrior doesn't get, it doesn't matter if the warrior gets affected or not by some mechanic necessarily. It's that even if someone else quite clearly is running about on the screen, you're still looking at his bloodthirst icon or something, you know?
Okay,
Like,
I sort of okay. I understand sort of your point. You're thinking like you would tunnel vision too much on how it's like playing the class, right?
yeah, that's
Um,
the base point I'm trying to make, because that's what I do when I watch my role or my specific spec being played, and I find myself being distracted from watching the fight, not how you play the fight.
okay. Yeah. So I definitely have some thoughts on this then because I get where that is coming from, but I think that that might be less true for depending on that might be more or less true, I guess, depending on what sort of spec you're playing or what sort of role you're doing. Um, because like if I'm watching Reves, I'm not watching his rotation, if that makes sense. I don't. There's nothing he can do that surprises me about this, right? I mean, and I like I know that he doesn't know any weird rotational thing that I don't know. Um, Super random tangent about this. Like I'm in Reves's Discord, and during the race in Amir Drasil, I think it was, or if it was in Aberus, I saw someone type to him. By the way, Reves, you know that if you macro these two spells together, there's a bug, so you lose 8 seconds of avatar. Because like there's things like procking each other off of each other, and he was using a macro to cast them at the same time, so he got this like bug, so he lost 8 seconds of avatar, and he didn't even know it until some random guy in his Discord told him, right? So I'm not watching him to like learn, my rotation or whatever, right? That I'm not trying to get that type of information, if that makes sense. What I'm more trying to do and what I more usually do is I'll pop up like a document or a spreadsheet or something, usually more like just a text document. Like I'll just open like Sublime or Notepad or whatever, just something where I can just edit text. Um, and I'll just write down, timestamps or whatever in the fight, and I'll say like, okay, well, so here I'll do these different things. Like here will be my cooldowns, or here will be my defensives, or whatever it may be. Um, and then I'll either, if it's very easy, I'll just remember that, or it will be more specific. Like I'll even make a weak aura to yell like press reflect now because I'll know exactly when to do it or something. So like one example that I still have the document. I still have like in my tabs within my Sublime editor. I still have like a note that is explaining exactly where to drop my orbs on Smoldron on every intermission and where to pick them up, because Warrior had a very weird like interaction with when your cooldowns were going to be ready every time since you were a 90-second class.
Yeah.
So basically, what I did when I first was going to play that fight was I watched Reves on the kill video and I looked exactly where he dropped those every time, and I just wrote that information down. But I didn't really care about like sort of his rotation or whatever, if that makes sense, right?
Okay.
So yeah, I would say I'm more interested in taking that type of information, and then how they would deal with different things like by watching many pulls. So yeah, I think that it might be different depending on the role, because I can understand that like as a disc priest, it's a lot more interesting. Like how are they setting up their ramp here, or as compared to
Yeah.
like a warrior, where it's like click your Swifty macro and do damage.
Yeah, at least I find myself getting very distracted by it. And then I realize something about talents, and then I pause the video and I look at something, and then I'm like, oh, okay, never mind. And yeah. So, but basically, we can say if you don't have any problems watching a video and not getting distracted by what they're doing, do it however you want. But if you're distracted more, unlike me, it's good to not watch the exact same spec you're playing if you're not intending to prepare the spec you're playing for the fight.
Yeah, and also probably don't just look at one kill pull and expect that that's how the fight's always going to look, right? Probably
Yeah.
look at the progress, or at least look at a few different kill videos or something.
Yeah.
Um, but
Okay, but if we did you have something else on heroic week?
no, 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 I wanted to move ahead, so definitely, yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, so if we're moving ahead then to the actual first, let's go the first mythic week. How does that look in general? I guess we can start. It doesn't have to be raid by raid, but like, how does the week progress?
Right. So I mean, I guess most likely it's going to start again with doing another set of splits, right? But that's going to be done within the first raid relatively quick. Like I think the second week heroic usually takes like 1 to 1.5 hour per run or something. I would probably say, depending on how hard the last boss is.
Mhm.
And then from there you're probably going to end up going into Mythic on that first raid, and at that point you will not have, or at least you haven't, when there wasn't heroic week, at least you haven't had that many kills to go on, because none of the top guilds have really even gone into that because they're doing so many splits. So yeah, I mean, you try to be as prepared as you can by just reading resources, but there's not going to be that many logs, and you're just going to sort of try to knock out the first few bosses, which usually aren't that hard, and usually don't need to like super deeply know all the mechanics. But yeah, I feel like the first Mythic week is kind of like a little bit stressful, right? You're doing like the heroic thing, and then you're just jumping in and just trying to like knock out all the easy bosses that you're sort of expected to kill, and then you
Yeah.
usually end up being on some boss that requires some level of progress, depending on how good your guild is. Like our old guild in like Amir Rasil, I think the first week we ended up on Naimu, right? I think that was what ended up happening,
Yeah.
and we ended up sort of just progressing that for the rest of the week, pretty much.
Yeah. And then, okay, so that's about the first week then.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you think? I don't know. I feel like the first week is kind of the almost the least interesting because you're doing all of the easy bosses, right? And you usually don't get that far into any of the more complex bosses, and there's usually not that many resources available. Do you have a
Yeah.
different take on the first week, or how do you feel?
Yeah, I think for me it's I feel like I have way more to do in the first week of, even if it's heroic or mythic, because there's so many things to set up. So let's say we we're stepping into mythic in 2 days. I'm sort of torn between waiting to prepare healing cities for the group or for myself, doesn't really matter, to like prepare for the fight in before, because I don't have access to the correct information, not easy information, right, in logs and whatnot. And waiting as long as I can, but having less time to do it. And then I have to predict how many bosses do I think I'm gonna have to prepare for. Because I can't really, or I'm not, me personally, I don't want to go into a fight not knowing when to press all my cooldowns initially, right? I always have a base plan. So
Yeah,
I feel like the Wednesday is the worst, or like the first mythic raid is the worst, because I'm not sure if I'm gonna do 1 or 3 bosses yet, so I'm prepared for 3. And then I think the longer the week goes, the more chill it becomes. Because I do quite. I don't like having to prepare for potentially 5 bosses and then splitting my time for that instead of just preparing for 1, like it becomes sooner in the progression. Then I really know what I'm preparing for, you know.
yeah,
So I'd say, yeah, it's definitely the most stressful time. It's the first reset.
yeah. It's often, even if you've already done the bosses on heroic, it's usually very hard to gauge how hard bosses
Yeah.
will be on mythic. It's usually very hard to like, because it's such a waste to like over prepare, right? Like you're spending like 2 hours researching how to min max on boss and then it dies in 2 pulls. That's such a like waste of time, right? And then maybe because you did that, then you were underprepared for the next boss that ended up taking 22 pulls, which could have only been 15 pulls if you had prepared more for that, or it's a bit hard to know oftentimes. I feel like in
Yeah,
that first
and
week.
from the healer perspective, right now I can sit and spend an hour or more on each of the first 5 bosses and do my take on what the healing cities would be. But if I wait until Wednesday at 17 when I get home from work, I can just look at a log and I can pretty much copy paste a log that has killed the boss into the sheet. And I know that this is a killable healing cooldown strategy, right?
Yeah,
But that, even though it will take an hour, it will take like 15 minutes or something to just copy paste it, and you have to do it for several bosses, and then you sort of have to understand it for yourself, for your cooldowns to some extent. And it's very weird with the time investment. So I haven't done any sort of, like, I prepared for the mythic bosses, but I haven't done any cooldown preparation or whatever. And I will wait to check on logs because I feel like it gives me more to go through whatever class I'm playing, go through the logs, do healing cooldowns, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
but it's quite a time crunch, you know, when you're raiding. Especially Wednesday and Thursday are by far the worst. The first Wednesday and Thursday should be the most fun part of the new tier, but I think it's the worst part for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I mean, it's lucky if in that sense that we're on EU, right? Because then at least you have NA like almost ahead, a full day ahead, right? So you already have much more information. Because if we were playing on NA, and I guess for anyone playing on NA, that's very, very rough comparatively. Because when you go into the raid, there will definitely be no logs because no one, unless like someone started like 1 hour before you or whatever, because like all the guilds are day raiding, they're not going to public log at all. No way, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to come in with very little information, whereas we actually usually sort of in the first week or even to some extent in the second week, we're going to get sort of that advantage. Well, it's not an advantage versus those guilds necessarily, but it's like it makes it a lot easier that there are guilds on on a similar level that have already pulled the bosses or already even
Yeah.
killed the bosses, right?
Yeah, this might actually end up being a EU advantage for non-raise the world first or non-super high-end guilds.
Yeah.
Because you won't have to waste any time. You'll probably have a better mood because you've just copied some working strat and you haven't had to work through kinks and whatnot, and you're like 12 hours behind, but that might not even matter, right? Because there is a guild that is so much better than you and on NA that it catapults you maybe the first week or two.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that. Yeah, I wouldn't dismiss like a theory that said that at some world rank it's an advantage to be on EU versus NA.
Yeah, I think that's very plausible for our yeah, for some higher world rank that's not super high or like top 15, you know.
Yeah, yeah, like somewhere like between maybe 15 and 50 or something, or 100 or some number. At some point there's probably some advantage.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
you don't even have to take a risk of like we will know if we look at the early shift or wherever, we will see what their wipe count is on respective bosses, right?
yeah,
And we can do an informed decision on what to do. And some other guild will have done an informed decision incorrectly and just waste the time, basically.
yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah, for sure.
But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you
I
can get
think you
baited as
can
well, but yeah,
I think you can for both heroic week and mythic week is not they're not very dissimilar for me, where the early week is sort of just scrambling to prepare for the fight as a whole and for healing cooldowns, and the later part of the week I can more take time to refine what I'm doing, like what's the rotation like, what's the builds like, what trinkets do people play, you know, stuff like that I can usually do later in the week. And
yeah,
then it's quite quickly after the first reset of Mythic, it becomes way more chill, where I feel like there's a lot of time to prepare, and there's no time limitation on the amount I prepare. It's just how much I CBA, pretty much.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, to be fair, I guess like the first, I mean, depending on the number of bosses in the tier, but like in a tier like this where it's 8 bosses, right? I think it's probably fair to say that the first 4 or 5 bosses, they're probably on, even on Mythic, they kind of feel like heroic bosses, right? They don't feel, they're tuned a little bit harder, etc. But the mechanical complexity usually isn't that high. I mean, the fifth boss on Mythic, right? It probably doesn't have that much more mechanical complexity than the last boss on Heroic. Whereas then on the last 2 or 3 bosses, depending on the tier, or even 4 bosses if you look at that, like Sepulcher, right? Or even 5 maybe. You start seeing like a significant ramp up to what's actually happening on the fights, and how many pulls you're gonna have to put into it, how much prep you're gonna have to put into it, how much you're gonna have to min max things. Because
Yeah,
definitely the early bosses on Mythic, you don't need to min max many things. It doesn't matter if people randomly pop their cooldowns wrong or something. Usually, it's not. You usually don't get punished much for those type of mistakes.
yeah, but usually the first week can become sort of an issue with gear. I don't know if the heroic week now will even be that much better, since they've increased the amount you can upgrade gear to, right? So we will still have relatively low item level compared to what we will have in 2 months, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So some I feel like we've been through this several times where we on the first week we get to a boss, we can't kill it. It's not hard. We can't really kill it. We can't do enough DPS or healing, and then we go reset 2 and it just falls. And this might be sort of the same thing, but just at the next boss or something when we're actually doing splits and being better geared.
Yeah, I mean, splits is one thing for sure, but I also think that a lot of those things has to do with the skill level of the guild as well, right? And I think that our old guild, like which was a little bit over like world rank 100, 130, or I don't remember something. Um, and that was like at its
At
peak as well.
peak,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, I mean, if you compare to the guilds we're going to be playing with in this tier, I think that just the general sort of skill level as well probably allows you to power through a lot of more things than you might otherwise do. So it's going to be, yeah, I mean, just going to be, interesting to feel that difference now, if there is any, in terms of like
yeah,
how easy the first bosses feel, or if you feel like you can sort of get stuck on like a Teros style boss, right? Or something if you feel like under geared or just underpowered.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
But if we sort of move to the sort of last step, I guess, which I would call like late progress or something, right? Where we're talking about the last two, maybe last three bosses, right? And it's gonna take a couple of raids, like at least like 3 raids for the third last boss, right, or something, and then the second to last boss maybe it's gonna take like 4 or 5 raids. I mean, and the last boss maybe even like 8 raids, depending on like if it's super hard or not, right? You don't know. Like it can take a lot longer of a time now. So we're looking at something very very different now compared to what we were looking at early on.
Mm-hmm.
How does your sort of prep change at this point in the tier when we're sort of nearing the end and we're actually getting to the quote unquote real fights?
I think, first of all, there's no better feeling for me than when you've done the first draft of the healing cooldowns for the last boss mythic. That's such a good feeling. Like it feels like you're done. You will have to alter something, but yeah, then I feel like, oh, half of the work is done. But
Yeah.
I think it will be different now versus before when I had to prepare more for the whole raid, because when you prepare for the whole raid, I think I sat a lot in logs and trying to figure out specific issues and timings and changing some sort of raid plan or finding a way to explain, like a lot more leadership preparation, I suppose. Meanwhile, now I think I'll be back to just still scouring logs, but way more to just optimize what I'm doing, because we're getting to a point where it does actually matter if I'm doing something a tiny bit better, you know?
Yeah.
So it basically leads to, since you're spending more time on the boss, I'm spending more times minimaxing the boss. Even though I'm just doing the same thing just in more detail, and you can go phase by phase. So let's say you're pulling the second to last boss. You know you're gonna probably pull the second to last boss for the first time tomorrow. Then I've done a lot of preparation, or I'm trying to do a lot of preparation on P1. But I don't give a fuck about P2 or P3. Like I'm just trying to start the fight knowing exactly what to do, and then you sort of build upon that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
to maybe expand a little bit on that, I mean, I think if we look at like many bosses like that, let's I mean, think maybe a good example from last year's like Tindril Mythic, right? Where you almost have, I mean, that's maybe that's probably like the worst or best, depending on how you look at it, example of this, where like you you have something happening like every 10 seconds you have to deal with a full set of mechanics. Like there's just like constant barrage of mechanics coming your way. There's never like 5, 10 seconds, whatever, on Tinder where you're just standing and waiting, right? You're just full action, right?
yeah,
And in a fight like that, you can be pretty sure, especially if you look at like other people who've already been attempting the boss, even if they haven't killed it, you can look at their logs or their VOD or whatever, and you can see like, okay, so if this other guild that is of a similar world rank to us usually, if they've wiped 40 times now and they still haven't gone through P1, I probably don't have to worry about P2 for a while.
yeah,
So I think that's a very important thing to be very very like, what do you say, almost very clear about, or like I can't enough stress the importance of not trying to understand and like plan out, say, all of Tindrol before you pull the boss the first time, because it's
Yeah.
such a waste of like your brain power, right? Even phase one, you might not even have to prepare like the whole phase one, because there's gonna take it's gonna take a long time before you're gonna break through phase one. And it's much more important to focus on the details of how you're going to get there step by step, and almost like plan out in increments of 10-15 seconds and make it through
Yeah.
that phase, you know?
Yeah, so if I'm being realistic and saying we're gonna pull Tindrell tomorrow, I will probably put, if I'm just preparing for myself, as I'm gonna be now as a raider, like mainly for myself, I will at most prepare like an hour more, because I've already at some earlier point I've looked through the fight and I paid attention and then I've updated my sheet or whatever. Like I have some basic understanding of the whole fight by doing little prep, right?
Yeah.
But if I'm pulling Tindrell tomorrow, if I have exactly 60 minutes to prep, I will spend 60 minutes to prep P1. I will not, like, I will at most look at where do I put the first dispel in P2 or something, right? But I will spend all the time just looking at P1, because I know from just having watched Race the World first, or just in 40 seconds looking at Raider IO and like pull count and counter graph, whatever you can see, there's no way we're getting any further, right? We're probably not even passing P1. So as you're stressing, and I'm stressing again, like you're literally spending all the time you're preparing should be spent on the only plausible part of the fight you can be in. And then once you've understood and played P1 for a night, maybe you start looking into P2 a bit. But you really should take it step by step, because trying to understand the whole fight is completely meaningless. And you still won't have understood it perfectly since you haven't played it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's actually something kind of interesting here to think about, you know, if we sort of follow along this theme a little bit, which is that a lot of times, especially on the last two bosses, definitely on the last boss, but I think last two bosses, at least for Tindrell and Fyrak, it was the case, right? Where phase one is kind of the hardest phase, or at least the one you're going to spend the most time in. And it doesn't help you anything if you like fluke and get through phase one in 10 or 1 in 20 pulls. That doesn't help you. Whereas the later you come in the fight, the more important it becomes to be able to, if you come to a new point, to just do anything you can to just get through it. Because if you look at something like Fyrak, right, and you say that, okay, so it's going to take us, I don't know, 50 pulls to get through phase one cleanly until we're going to start learning it, right? First of
Yeah.
all, we're always going to do phase one, so we need to be consistent with it, even after those 50 pull shots, because we're going to keep doing phase one. But also, like when we come later and when we look at like P3 or something, it's definitely possible that the kill pull that you're going to have on Fyrak, it could be kind of a fluke, right? Just, you know, the best people in your guild, or the most prepared people, got the mechanics, and then people randomly managed to dodge things without knowing what they were doing, and then randomly you killed Fyrak while your previous best pull was like 14% or something.
Yeah.
That's kind of possible, right? But it never helps you to do that sort of earlier in the fight. But the closer to the end you get, it becomes more and more important to have at least some of the idea of what's going to happen in the sort of part where you're not quite at yet, because you might actually be able to like squeeze out a kill much earlier than you might otherwise have been able to, if you kind of were able to sort of play off of like sort of a fluke or whatever you wanna call it.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, you for sure want to glance ahead a tiny bit, but you should still be quite rigid with because you are only gonna spend so much time preparing, right? So use the time preparing for what's important right now. And I feel like it can be a slippery slope to plan too far ahead, in many other ways that we haven't mentioned. Like if you know you need spell reflect in P2 at the start, you might die in P1, and you'll slow down the progression of getting there. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of things you technically could do with bloodlust and potions and cooldowns just to get forward. Like you will increase your DPS significantly just by pulling the boss 100 more times. Same goes with healing, and a lot of things will just get better. So you shouldn't pretty much ever just hold stuff to practice from the start. I think that's quite a bad practice, sort of preparing for the worst almost, right? Like playing a harder version of P1 just because you will have to play it like that in the end. I mean, sometimes that might be, in some unique cases, I think that's the way to go, but in general, just you need to progress the fight and you need to make P1 consistent. And I think it's way more consistent to throw everything you have at it and then very meticulously pick away few things like, okay, Very, you do not put cooldowns here, right? Instead of having you not do it from the start. If
Yeah.
it's something that only affects a later, like a part of the fight you wouldn't get to that night, like no way.
Yeah, I mean, like I guess like a pretty good example of that would be like if you would bloodlust in the intermission on Firac, right, to break the shield,
Yeah,
because it's such a waste to wipe to like not killing the shield from damage, right?
yeah,
Whereas, well, Firac in that sense is a bad example just because you usually bloodlusted, um, you usually did bloodlust on pull, I guess, but maybe Tindril would have been a better example, saying like maybe it's not a great example to maybe it's not a great idea to bloodlust on pull on Tindril if it means that you're gonna push one mechanic set earlier, because then you
yeah,
never get to practice that. So I think it's definitely good to have that sort of in your arsenal to say like, well, we can do these things now to keep the pool going and we can see more of the fight and we can sort of learn the points we actually want to progress on. But yeah, of course, it's a double-edged sword, right? There's you should definitely be
yeah,
careful not to sort of skip an overlap or skip a mechanic or something that you're not going to skip on your kill, because then you're going to have a really bad time when you're going to change that later, I guess.
yeah. And I think you made a good point earlier as to when you sort of can't be too optimistic here, but when in theory the boss actually becomes killable, that's the point. I think it's really important to over prepare for a part of the fight you haven't been in, because there is a lot of RNG involved in when you kill the boss. Like, I think one usually says that you kill the boss when the two worst players have understood the fight, and I think on average that's kind of true. But throughout the tier, you will have fights where you kill the boss when you didn't really deserve to kill the boss, only because, as you said, like the best people or the people understanding the fight the best, got the important mechanics, and you just somehow solved it. And that really doesn't matter if you still talk about Tindral as an example. It doesn't really matter if you get 30 seconds further ahead in P2 for the first time than you would have. I'm betting it's better than not, but in reality, it wouldn't really affect your progress much. Honestly, it could even progress affect it negatively, because then some people will assume you're gonna get there again soon. But that's not an argument as to not to prepare. But
Yeah,
um,
yeah, no,
I think this not preparing ahead only becomes false when you can kill the boss, because then it's good to be a bit over prepared for a fluke.
yeah. I think there's some
Some
weird
point.
like inverse relationship of how far you are into the fight and how far in advance it makes sense to prepare, kind of.
Yeah.
Because when you're nowhere into the fight at all, it doesn't matter that much. But the longer you're in, the more opportunity cost you have to wipe to random things, and you might have more gain from actually seeing things or even being able to randomly kill something.
I mean, in some ways, this stays true for every fight, because like the first boss is killable from the first pull, and the
Yeah,
second boss is also killable. So maybe that's the question you ask yourself: can the boss die tonight? And that's the gauge of what type of preparation you do. Because
yeah,
there's many bosses where there's not even a 1% chance, like there's a 0% chance the boss will die tonight. There's no precedent whatsoever. And then just prepare the first half or whatever seems suitable.
yeah. Um, like I thought about something here. I don't like. Would you like? This is kind of random, but what do you think about this? Like, um, if you look at like a few different guilds now, like compared to each other, right? So you're looking at the race between like Echo and uh, Liquid, right? So, or the top, they're gonna kill the boss, when all of their players know what to do, right? You know, that's like how they're gonna do. Like they're all gonna know what they're doing, and they're all gonna, you know, prepare, and they might even need to get some good RNG with like crits or shit if it's like super close, right? But like for them, it's like everyone's gonna know what to do.
Mhm.
If you take like one step up in the ranks, right, and you compare two guilds that are like at the world rank 50 or something, or world rank 100 or something, then at that point, two guilds that are similarly skilled could diff a lot on the pulls if they end up with that whole thing where, okay, so one guild got really lucky to where all of their good players or players who knew what would happen in the last phase got the mechanics and they just kill it kind of early, whereas another guild will not be lucky with that and they'll get it on their bad players. And and at that point you're sort of gated by your last two.
Yeah.
And so the one guild kills it by, you know, by virtue of being a little bit lucky, and the other one, you know, maybe doesn't. And then if you go even one step further, you come out to like the, you know, world rank 500 guild or whatever. They're never killing the boss until they get that RNG because none of their like, you know, so it's sort of, I don't know, it's sort of when you go in the ranks, sort of start shifting to the point where like everyone knows what to do, and then you get to a point where like, well, only very few people know what to do, and
Yeah.
only if those people get the mechanics can you actually kill the boss.
Yeah, it might actually be a lot like that. Let's say, like the worst players will still improve like a small amount each pull or every 10 pulls or something. Because I would think what you're saying is true, and it is quite interesting that a lot of guilds have very similar pull counts, and it increases, not linearly, but like it does increase a lot when you get into higher and higher world ranks, even with nerfs and stuff. So maybe it is statistically likely that it takes 300 pulls to kill Tindral post all nerfs, because it takes about 300 pulls with the top 10 learning and the bottom 10 not learning as fast and then just getting the kill.
Yeah, or not getting the mechanics, I guess. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, the worse the guild gets, right, the more it just has to be the stars have to align. I mean, there might even come a point in like world rank 5,000 where, oh, well, I guess they don't kill Tindral, but like whatever the worst guild is that kills, like the race to world last, you know, like world rank
Yeah.
1500, right? There might even come a point where no one is good enough to get the mechanics, but they need to be lucky that they accidentally manage to do the mechanics when they get them because they're just running around and hopefully they do the right thing, kind of. I don't know. I have a very bad sense of how good or bad our world rank 1500 guild is, though. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I have no clue.
Yeah. Well.
But yeah, it's an interesting theory. I think it to some extent is true. But it's also to some extent true for a top 50 guild, right? Like I don't think there will be a big discrepancy in the performance of the worst player and the best player, even in the top 50 guild.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Yeah.
you just statistically, if 18 people know what to do, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, probably there's still like I don't know, but I mean, surely the best player in Echo and the worst player in Echo, that's still, you know, that's still probably, I don't know, 20% or 15%
yeah,
difference, right, in skill. I don't know, but maybe that also, depending on the role, that might not have as much impact. Yeah. Um, Maybe the last thing I wanted to mention here that I think is something to think about is that, um, for like, it's been true to an extent, of course, but it's going to be true to a much greater extent for us now. Is that this tier when we're going to be rating in slightly higher, more higher end guilds than we have been before, there's going to be fewer and fewer guilds. I mean, just in general, obviously, that are killing the bosses before us, but also that have public logs.
yeah.
How do you feel like this is going to impact everything?
I think in some ways it might have some small effect, but I don't think it will have a big impact because generally you're interested in watching the best logs that you can. And it's still very true that the best logs that we can find will be progressing ahead of us. So maybe it could be a bit awkward the less meta you play and the more things you have to figure out because you don't have the same tanks or healers or range comp. But I think probably a lot of these issues sort of solve themselves by being a higher rated guild. You probably have sort of more more the same. I don't even know how you say it. A more similar comp and a more similar solution to the fight, and you're playing sort of the same version of the fight or very minor nerfs. So at the end of the day, I don't think it will affect. I don't think it will affect me much, because the only times I can think of when I've been actively looking at logs from worse guilds, it's most often been because we have some sort of situation that's not true for Pop Tart Corn Dog or something.
Yeah.
Um, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think usually I like to sort of look at sort of an aggregate of data, right? Especially for, for my own sort of class decisions, like, talents or cooldown timings or all of these things, right? But yeah, so I looked at this the other day, right? And my guild is let's see, we are number 5 in the world of guilds that public log. And all the other guilds that are public logging are within 12 world ranks of us. So I guess like when we pull the last boss, there will be 0 public logs of the last boss, I guess.
A kill, yeah, but you have the logs of
Yeah.
them progressing the fight.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna get at. So I feel like what's gonna end up happening is you're gonna be looking a lot more at logs of incomplete logs, if that makes sense, right? Logs that haven't killed it. Because for example, when we would have gotten to Tindral, Pop Tart Corn Dog probably already had been done with phase 1, right? So I would already have all that information.
Yeah.
So I think it's just going to shift to a lot of things where like you're not going to look at final kills, and you're probably going to look at more sort of logs in progress. And in that sense, you can even look probably at guilds that are behind you, because they might still be progressing the same fight, etc. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it might change a bit on what if you're used to only watching kill videos, then you might have to adapt a bit. But I don't know if it's logical to separate this, but I think it's a much bigger effect that the guild you're looking at is closer to you than it being fewer logs. If you understand what I mean. Like not having the kill log and kill video is a much bigger effect than only having 3 VODs and logs to look at in comparison to 20.
Yeah, so
Um,
I'm not super worried about it from like the strategy perspective, if that makes sense. I'm more worried about it from the perspective of if other people have already done this whole trial and error of how is it smart to play warrior here, if that makes sense. Things that you can't necessarily very easily pick out. Like it's possible to pick it out from a VOD maybe, but it's a lot easier to pick it out from having like 10, 20 logs that you could look at or something, right? So that's the only part that I feel like is going to be a bit different from what I've been sort of used to. But again, yeah, I don't think it's going to be a major difference. And yeah, it's not going to be major, but it's going to be interesting to see if it's if we can sort of revisit it after progress, and we can see how it feels.
yeah, yeah. I'm not as worried, or I don't think it's gonna be that much of a difference for me, especially when I'm not planning for the raid, and we will have a much more similar comp. I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's probably going to be the case. Did you have anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah, I just it's not really tips and tricks, but I thought I'd mention a few resources and what they do in case someone is actually still listening and don't really know about all the resources that are commonly used and available.
Yeah, it's a strong assumption that someone other than our moms are listening, but sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, but we can speak very briefly on each one if you're also familiar with them.
Yeah, for sure.
But the first one is lorgs.io,
Yep.
and I'm pretty sure that's spelled lorrgs.io.
Yep.
And it's basically you can either look at public ranked logs or you can insert a log, but it gives you a very neat timeline of whatever spells you have selected for that person you're looking at. And I think the best part about it from a healing perspective is that you can just click and export the ERT timings and notes of it. A point to be made though is that it is not perfect since the ERT note is not considering phases. So it doesn't provide you with a sort of whole solution. But let's say that I'm generally interested of when they're using the seedling weird trinket from a Midrasil, or I'm curious about when a Mistweaver uses his Shaylun gift or something a bit more niche. That's a great way to go about it. And I also feel like getting a timeline, especially when just looking at rankings on a boss, you can see patterns really quick. Like, oh, 9 out of 10 warriors use his recklessness here. This is probably a decent timing, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely second that. Lorgs is pretty great. Of course, it loses a bit or a lot of value if you know, with respect to what we were just saying before, like if you're one of the first public logging guilds, you're gonna have a lot less resources available to use there, but it's still be very useful. And yeah, the whole phasing thing, I think for progress, usually people have the same sort of timings, so then it's not super impactful. But if you're a guild that gets there much later or during farm, you might be careful to not try to steal the timings. I mean, I can think of like an example in the pre-patch. I was like, I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna prepare super much for like the pre-patch raid, but like we were gonna kill Tindrod with like a boost run or whatever. And so then we go in, and then I saw like all the best, I think all the best like logs that I could find. They all pop their cooldowns on like the 50-second mark or whatever it is, like when the second set of roots spawned. But since we bloodlusted on pull, we didn't even get that part of the fight. So obviously that wasn't
Oh,
an
okay.
option for me. So I had to pop it on, on pull or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's some, you can sort of run into some issues, but usually during progress, at least, unless you're like a really low ranked guild, then usually you'll play progress the same as everyone else, and then yeah, it's super useful.
Yeah, it's a nice quick overview. And if you're a healer, you can, or a DPS that uses ERT notes and weak auras, you can quickly, just by clicking icons, like it's a very intuitive user interface, and you can just select what you want to see.
Yeah, for sure.
I realize I did this backwards now because I've been referring to logs, but I just wanted to mention Warcraft logs.
Yeah.
.com, obviously a good resource.
Yeah, I'm assuming
Yeah.
except for our moms, I guess, yeah, most people listening probably, if anyone, probably know about Warcraft logs, pretty famous site.
Yeah. And then I have questionablyepic.com. And you go to the live tab. This is a healer resource. It's the best solution we have to sims. You can sim your gear, and you can check what trinkets are good and embellishments, and you can put in the Simcraft profile, the SimC add-on text. I'm not gonna go over it any more than that. It's just it's a good place to gear optimize for healers.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you don't really have a comment on that.
No, it's no, not really, no.
And then I guess you have Lorgs, I guess, is which I mentioned first. That's a resource that's dependent on Warcraft logs. And there are a couple of more I won't go into detail to, but I'll mention them as a resource that takes logs and present them to you in a different way than logs, so it's a bit more intuitive. But you also have wipefest.gg and WoW Analyzer.
Yeah.
.com. And then lastly, I just also for healers, I'd say Viserio sheets. You can pretty much just Google Viserio healing sheets, cooldowns. You'll get redirected to a Discord, and that's the modern way of doing it if you're not. And what I mainly wanted to mention was that he's created a web application this time, so you're not stuck in Google Sheets. It's also quite a nice user interface where you get a timeline of the mechanics of the fight, probably usable by more than healers. Probably won't ever be used by anyone but a healer. But it's sort of similar to Lorg's Very, where you can see the timeline of the mechanics, sort of, but you can insert your own cooldowns.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hadn't, I didn't know you were going to bring up the tips and tricks section, so obviously I hadn't sort of prepared a list of my own, but I guess the only one, oh no. No, but the only one that I would sort of add on to your list, obviously, is that instead of questionably epic, if you're a DPS, you're probably going to go to raidbots.com, right?
Oh yeah.
Which would be very similar. You would use the simulation craft add-on, and you would sort of get like a snapshot of your character, and then you can sort of sim yourself. Sim being simulate, so you can see like how much damage would you gain from certain items or certain talents, or maybe more interestingly, if you're more of like a min-maxer and you think maybe you know better than the people who have theory crafted before you, you can go in and change a lot of things. I guess my tip there would be that like if you run a simulation and you click on the full HTML report and you scroll down all the way to the bottom, there's going to be a section called profile that you can expand. If you copy this entire thing in the profile, that will have all the information that went into your sim. And that will include like all your character information, but it will also have all the information like which APL is being used, which is just the action priority list, which is basically means like what rotation is this simulation following. And so then you can go back into Raidbots and paste this thing in under the advanced tab, and then that would run the exact same thing for you. But then you can sort of edit that if you want, and you can try and see like, wait, what happens if I prioritize this ability over this, or under these conditions I do that, or whatever. So that's something I do quite a bit, and it's more like oftentimes the people who've made the public APL, they're not gonna miss some crazy thing, and you're gonna be like figuring out how to do 10% more damage or something. That's usually doesn't happen. Sometimes things like that can happen, but usually that doesn't happen. But what you can usually do is if you go in there and you look at like, well, this is kind of complex to do in my head all the time rotationally. I wonder if I can simplify this and only lose like 0.1% DPS. Maybe that's better because I'm more likely to actually do it correctly. And that's something I've been doing a lot in the past few tiers, just trying to like either simplify, or if it's not good to simplify them, I'll make a weak aura that helps me with making these like min-max type of decisions. And that's something I've been trying to do to sort of squeeze out that last little bit of DPS.
Yeah. I'll be super happy if at least one person didn't know about one of the resources. Because otherwise it feels kind of stupid to to announce for the higher end at least quite commonly known resources.
Yeah, for sure. But we were also like 1 hour 42 minutes into the podcast, so or something like that.
Okay, this is gonna be no one here.
Yeah, so like yeah, I think we could pretty much say anything at this point and no one would know. You're pretty safe.
Okay, so do you have anything else to say then?
No, I guess it's the on this podcast we have sort of the eternal question, right?
Yeah.
Which is how do you end a podcast?